Welcome to the Kara's Cure Show, where we explore the cutting edge of wellness. I'm Kara Sundland. Today we're talking about the myths about ADHD. You might think you really understand this, but of course people who have a diagnosis know there's a lot to it. And we're going to take a deep dive with child psychologist Dr. Saunders from the Institute of Living. We're learning about the latest symptoms and why some people don't even get diagnosed due to misunderstanding about how it manifests in adults and kids. So thank you so much for being with us, Doctor.
Thank you, Kara. Thanks for having me.
You know, it used to be that people thought you'll grow out of it. That's a myth?
That is a myth. So what we know is that when your brain is in some way neuroatypical, it generally stays that way. Now, that doesn't mean that you cannot learn strategies to modify things. I mean, and when we're talking about an attentional disorder, we're really talking about three core symptoms: inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity, or the motoric restlessness component. Now, as someone gets older, it might be that, you develop ways to sort of modify your behavior. You can learn strategies to help you focus attention, and you can learn strategies to not be so impulsive. So there are ways to sort of take the edge off, but it doesn't mean that it's not still there.
Right, right. Okay. So I do want to talk about some of those strategies, which are going to be so important coming up, but let's get through another myth. We think of ADHD and you might picture a hyperactive boy who can't sit in his seat and is blurting out answers in school and ants in his pants. So if you're not hyperactive, you don't have ADHD. Well, that's a myth, right?
What we see developmentally is that at certain developmental stages, it becomes more evident. For example, that individual you described, the example of the kind of restless boy, talking out, tapping their pencil on the desk, jumping out of their seats, that is very obvious and is often seen right in elementary school. When you get to middle school, you do, and then high school, you tend to see more of the inattentive types. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity, right? If you don't have the hyperactivity component, you have more of the inattentiveness. So once you hit middle school and high school developmentally, when tasks and school in general is more long-term. So it's, you have more long-term assignments. If you think about middle school from elementary school, you're changing from class to class to class. You keep forgetting which book to have for which class. So then you have to go back to your locker and get your book because you forgot your book. So in middle school and high school, where organizational skills are much more apparent and pulled upon, that's when you see more of the inattentive types.
And that doesn't mean that they don't need treatment, right? So, I mean, some of the other symptoms you're talking about, it might be interrupting conversations, chronic lateness, forgetfulness, like I lost this, I lost that, or disorganized workspace. There might be the kids with really disorganized backpacks and desks and can never find anything. Right.
So for that matter, we all need strategies, right? But these young people definitely need strategies on how to better organize themselves or how to, if you think about a lot of the kind of symptoms that you just mentioned, organizational skills is really at the heart of them. So the better you can learn organizational skills and cognitive strategies to sort of stop and think, okay, I'm going to period 4. What do I need for period 4? This is day B. It's a Wednesday, day B, period 4. I have this class. And so it's using some strategies to help yourself so that the inattention doesn't always make you feel like you are 3 steps behind.
And that's important because there's a lot of gifts sometimes with ADHD. There's a great book called ADHD is Not a 4-Letter Word. You might have creativity, you might have a lot of energy, but sometimes in a school space, these kids, and adults for that matter, who haven't been diagnosed and they're at work, they could get a negative self-image because they constantly think that they're not keeping up or doing things the way other people are doing them.
a lot of these young people get a lot of negative feedback. If you think about it, sit down. Why didn't you remember this? Stop talking out so much, right? They get a lot in the course of a school day, they get a lot of negative feedback. And sometimes one of the silly questions that I often ask myself is, like as a child psychologist, like 100 years ago, what did these, is this a current day phenomenon? What did we do 100 years ago? Well, 100 years ago, these were the kids that were sent to work on the farm or were working in the factory and weren't paying good attention. And then, their fingers got cut off on some big, like these young people have been around, but we exist in a society where we go to school all day long. And so school is meant to be for those individuals who have an ability to focus, who can pay attention, right? So it's set up sort of against the grain of these neuroatypical, some of these neuroatypical young people. And so that's why we have to teach them strategies. Now, we have free education so that we can better ourselves as a society and a community. But I do actually think that a lot of these young people do great in trades, because the trades are very hands-on, whether you're an electrical or plumbing or mechanic, they're very hands-on, which can be much more stimulating than sort of sitting and reading a book and writing a paper and doing those kinds of things.
Yeah, I interviewed Bobby Flay. No one's going to say he's not successful. And he said he knew from a very early age he just couldn't do the school thing. So he went to trade school to learn how to cook. And, I don't know, some couple dozen restaurants later, he's doing okay. But so part of it, another person I was reading, the head of JetBlue, said that he couldn't have invented JetBlue if he didn't have ADHD, because he had to think outside of the box. So a part of the strategy that I understand a lot of psychologists talk about is find those strengths, like play to the strengths, find something they're passionate about or something they want mastery in.
Yes, and it's about knowing your, for parents and even for teachers, it's about knowing your children, right? So I have a brother that's probably the poster child for, was as a child and as an adult, right? And he couldn't remember anything in terms of schooling, but he knew every single football play. Like when you capitalize on what someone's strengths are, and you put them in an environment where they get actually more positive feedback and they're using their natural skills, you're going to get a lot more success with those kinds of individuals.
Yeah, and let's talk about another myth. Oh, it's no big deal. We're all a little ADD.
Well, the part of that myth is ruling out what also could be contributing to inattention. So people with severe anxiety can appear inattentive because they might repeat things or they might need to know things. Can you just tell me? They might appear to have some of the overlapping symptoms, but it's really at a core of anxiety. Also looking at stress-induced kind of inattention or hyperactivity. So looking at the context that someone's in, if it's a highly stressful situation, they could be more motorically restless. So I really do like to rule it out. What I do also like to emphasize when we talk so much about strategies is that there is that group of individuals that will respond positively to medications. And I've worked with dozens and dozens, at this point in my career, hundreds of parents who said, I don't want to medicate my child because it'll just drug them up. Well, really, what the research shows in these truly, kind of hyperactive, inattentive children is that stimulant medication is the primary medication, can slow them down just enough to help them learn strategies around impulse control and frustration tolerance. And if you think about impulse control and frustration tolerance, the two things that come to mind as someone becomes a teenager or young adult is substance use. So individuals who do not have the ability to control impulses and do not have the ability to tolerate frustration are far more likely, we're talking like 2 times more likely, to turn to alcohol, cocaine, or marijuana use. So it is, keeping in mind. So we're not trying to drug kids. We're just trying to give them a little bit of a help or support to take the edge off the impulsivity or inattention, because frustration tolerance and the inattention are really, really important things to address.
Yeah, and a lot of the justification is that for those who tolerate the stimulants, which I guess many articles have said they're one of the oldest things that we've been giving. They've been used in children for many, many decades. But you're basically trying to level the playing field because people with ADHD tend to have less dopamine, right? So what you're doing is giving them, hopefully, about the same amount of dopamine as a neurotypical person in school.
Yes. I mean, I didn't want to get too technical, but yes, that's pretty much it. So you're just trying to give them that advantage, that sort of level playing field, so that they can not be as impulsive, not feel so frustrated. Because if you think about a young person, when they have those constantly frustrating experiences, they start to turn away. I don't want to be in school. I don't want to be in these classes. I only want to be in phys ed because that's the only class that I can, release my energy. So the more negative experiences we set up for our young people, the more it just is so difficult for them to find their way or focus on their strengths.
So how do you get a real diagnosis? I think that's a struggle for people because even adults are going back and often getting diagnosed because their kids get diagnosed and it runs in families. So I say, oh, I struggled with those exact same things. Maybe I have it. What do I do?
You can see your, primary care doctor. There are, you can see a psychologist. There are some, self-report measures or assessment measures that can help determine if you meet criteria. And even if you are what we call sub-threshold, right? Even if you don't fully meet the criteria for a full-blown diagnosis, it doesn't mean that you don't have some tendencies. I talk a lot about spectrum disorders. I think an attentional disorder, probably like autism or anxiety, you can have low levels of inattention, low levels of impulsivity, lower levels of kind of motoric restlessness that might not meet full criteria, but are still debilitating in some way. So learning strategies can still be helpful.
What does ADHD look like in an adult, and why might it still be important to get a treatment as far as it is lifelong, right?
So it is lifelong. So you can see some of the core symptoms and how they play out in adults. So impulsivity might mean more impulsive spending, or poor financial planning, or poor organizational skills, job changes, relationship, inability to kind of sustain in a relationship. So you see how the symptoms manifest in different ways for adults than they do in children, based on the level of expectations for adults.
And as far as seeking treatment, at least in adults, maybe they'll take medication, or there's also some research that there are interventions that can make a big difference that maybe you're not going to medicate at this point.
Cognitive behavioral strategies can really be helpful. We also, there's also a good amount of research that shows that, you and I talk about this a lot. Mindfulness and meditation can actually be very, very helpful as well. It helps sort of train your brain to slow down a little bit, focus more, work on your distractions. For some people, they need the outside distractions in order to focus. So it's the reason that diagnosis can be important in some of these situations is because it helps you better understand yourself. Knowledge always is power. So the more you understand yourself, you realize, oh, it's not just me, that I need to actually listen to the radio while I'm doing work because I need that external distraction in order to focus. So while it looks different in adulthood, I think still getting a label or getting a better understanding really can be helpful.
If you're an adult, do you ask for accommodations at work or anything like that? I know we do accommodations at school, but what about if you're an adult?
I would hope that an adult has gotten themselves into a field where their strengths and their deficits work well in what they're doing, right? So someone with severe motoric restlessness probably wouldn't do so well as an accountant, where focusing, attention, and concentration are paramount. My hope is that, and often that's through trial and error or having unsuccessful experiences, but that you get yourself into a field where your strengths are highlighted. So if you're working in a job where you do get to move around a lot, or it doesn't require sustained attention and focus, if you are in a job where you feel like you're just getting a lot of negative feedback, it's just not working out, there are, life coaches, people that can help sort of shift you into an area that would be a better fit for you.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. In fact, I'll say, we've had some ADHD experts come on the shows here, and they said that our field, the media, filled with people who have ADHD. I think as a kid, I probably had some of those tendencies. I remember in second grade, my teacher using a timer to help me understand how much time I should have to complete an assignment. But we kind of thrive on chaos and crisis and deadlines, right? So, again, what you're saying is sometimes just we all have strengths and weaknesses. It's not so much about trying to say this is a disability, and although it can be classified that way to get accommodations, but it's not oh, this is awful, what am I going to do? This is, what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, so you can find what matches up, both how you organize yourself and where you work.
Yes, and you're right. So being in a field where there's actually sometimes pressure really helps people focus, like, oh, I have a deadline, okay, now I have to do it. Meanwhile, it as a parent, when your child has had 3 weeks to work on a project, and the night before is when they need you have to run out to the store at the last minute to get all the items for this project that they've had 3 weeks to work on. It is maddening as a parent in those situations, but boom, they get the whole thing done, and it's done by the class time. But from the outside, that's a really difficult way to work, right? We just know that having better organizational skills and doing check-ins to get something done, but those individuals thrive on that pressure, right? And they get it done on time. It just makes the people around them sort of lose their mind. So being in fields or areas where that kind of pressure doesn't have as much of a negative impact on the people around you, it does get draining over time, but the ability to adopt some strategies, sometimes there's some resistance to that because it's been working that way for a long time, even though it could have a negative impact on the people around you.
Yeah. So go with your strengths. The other thing is, what do you advise? Because I see this brought up a lot in articles and in blogs, that often, because it does run in families, the parents also have some ADHD issues like frustration tolerance and disorganization. And so when they have their child having a meltdown or disorganized, I mean, the match can be difficult. So what do you do for the parents and the children and to help with the relationship? What's recommended there?
So I've had different families that I've worked with where it was actually seeing the symptom presentation in their children that made them reflect on their own childhood and realize, oh my, this is how I was too.
Yeah.
And that can be really, really enlightening. And hopefully then you develop empathy for your own parent who had to manage all of this. And then, work to address it, because that experience for young people can be so frustrating. And as I said, so often it's filled with a lot of negative feedback. So it's like taking that empathy and saying, wow, I see myself in my child. I realize now that I had some very similar things. These are the strategies that I learned, sometimes the hard way, but strategies that I learned to help myself. You can offer them to your children, although often they don't want the strategies from their parents. But, that's where you can engage in some advocacy so they can have some help and support in school.
You bring up a good point. About the strategies and how to teach them, because I have the blessing of talking to really smart people like you and going home and telling my kids this is what we should do, even suggesting they listen to a podcast, and they don't want to hear it, but they might hear it from someone else, or I guess life teaches you. But what is recommended? Because if your child, I've seen both, that it's really more parent training that's recommended and how to manage it, and that sometimes therapy isn't going to really be effective for younger kids. But I've seen the other thing, that cognitive behavioral therapy can help. What do you think we should be doing?
It's always a combination of things, right? So it is some parent training. It's how to better manage a situation, or how to better set up the strategies so that your child can step into success. I'm also someone who says, sometimes failure experiences or difficult experiences are really powerful learning experiences. So you don't want to, be that helicopter or lawnmower parent. So where you just sort of pave the way for your child and there's no bumps in the road. So those experiences can really be filled with learning. However, we don't want so much negative feedback that it becomes self-defeating. Kids get more anxious and depressed because they've had so much negative feedback. So it's always trying to find that balance. My concern becomes if your child really is struggling in school, either socially and emotionally or academically, that is the time to talk to your school support personnel, talk to your child's teachers, and see if there's some strategies that can be put in place that better support them. Again, the child still has to take on the strategies. You can set up these great conditions, but if the child isn't motivated or engaged in learning some different things, it just makes it more difficult.
Yes, I can totally agree with that. So some of the accommodations, I mean, schools are really versed in ADHD, so it might be some extra timing on tests. It might be that they get a prompt to turn in their homework, because sometimes they just forget to turn it in. But ideally, you want them growing into their own, being more self-reliant. But so what do you do? What's the key? This is a big question. How do you motivate? I know I've asked you some loan situations. You said, tie something that they really want to what the behavior you're trying to teach. But explain that. If you're trying to motivate your child or yourself, how do we do that best?
So what you're trying to do in a lot of these situations is tie what we consider like high reinforcing behaviors with low reinforcing behaviors, right? In terms of strategies, you do what you don't want to do first, and then you save what you don't mind doing or what you like doing second or last. So you try to develop some strategies. I do think, there is some parent modeling in this where you want to allow opportunities to figure some things out, because that's how you learned as well. The key often here, and I've worked with so many parents that said, well, I don't want my child to get tied into like reinforcers for everything. But when you have a young person that is not internally motivated, right? There are some kids that are just internally motivated to please adults, internally motivated to do well in school. They have that internal motivation. There are that subgroup of young people that are not internally motivated and only working for external rewards. And so the hope would be over time, and that time could be years, over time, they will develop some greater internal motivation. But we all know those people that are only still, as adults, externally motivated. They just work paycheck to paycheck. They just work for, whatever. I've just finished this project, now I'm done, and now I'm going to reward myself, right? They're still externally motivated. They just never develop some of those internal motivation strategies. So we can try to attach them, but we can't necessarily force it.
Well, and you just mentioned it can take time, right? Where you think, okay, I just taught you this. Why did it not happen the next day or the day after? I mean, Dan Siegel, I think, was the author of, he talks about the brain development, and that might be a great, the whole brain child, I think is the name of the book. But give us an idea. ADHD is actually a disorder of executive function, and that's the part of the brain that could take a while, right? I mean, for a boy, their brain is still going to be growing until like 25 or 27, and girls 25. So time is a big factor?
Yes. So, and you brought up a good point about executive function. So I want to talk about that for a minute, because we use these terms sometimes and people don't understand what they are. So executive function is where our different parts of the brain control or do different things. And so in individuals who have disorders of executive functioning, it means, I've heard this analogy. It means that there's no band leader to the orchestra, right? The woodwind section's going off, and then the brass section's doing their own thing, and then the percussion section, they're just flying at their own beat, right? Executive functioning is having the coordination between the different areas of the brain so that you can work together. And sometimes it takes years. I mean, most young people don't have executive functioning. That's something that develops over time, over years. But in individuals who have pretty severe deficits in executive functioning, which would be considered a learning disorder, they have trouble coordinating the different parts of their brain. So So, organizational skills or longer term strategies are much harder for them to embrace and take on. So yes, individuals with severe ADHD can have also executive functioning difficulties.
Yeah, so there's strategies for that, but again, there's growth, right? So part of it, if you have a child, is the patience, because just by nature, your child with ADHD might be a little bit less developed in being organized or being on time than their peers, but there are also still years to come.
Yeah, so patience is really critical. And I think sometimes what happens as parents is you compare child A and child B, and you say, boy, child B was like at such a different level than child A, because children develop differently. And whether we call that, social emotional immaturity, whether we call that executive functioning issues, whatever we call that, I think it's really having the patience to let children develop on their own timelines. No two children are going to develop in the same way, even in the same household with the same parents and the same house and the same setting and the same school system. So having a little bit of patience, that also doesn't mean that you don't try to push them, try to help them develop strategies, try to get them extra support in school if that's what they need, but trying not to engage in so much comparison.
Yeah. Okay, so as we come a little bit to the end of our time, I definitely want to address girls too, because the research is showing that girls tend to be missed more, or they say, oh, it's caught later in 8th grade or high school. Is that because more girls tend to be inattentive, or we don't really notice it until the work really piles on?
Right. So girls tend to be a little bit more of the inattentive type, where, as I said, like in middle school and high school, where organizational skills become more prominent. And so the inattentive type, they don't have the motoric restlessness, they have more the inattentive type. So their organizational skills or lack thereof become much more apparent. And again, sometimes based on someone's level of intelligence, you can develop compensatory strategies, but it takes you 10 times more effort than a typical person to finish a task. And that can be draining, and that can create a lot of negative feedback loops. So yes, there is some higher rates of inattentive type in females.
Okay. You are at the Institute of Living. Is there some advice for people who are listening going, gosh, I really need a diagnosis? Do they start with their doctor, or they start with the Institute of Living?
I always like people to start with their pediatrician, because the pediatrician might have some self-report scales. Also checking with your school personnel, your school support personnel, they can be really helpful, because if you think about it, teachers have the greatest kind of developmental perspective, especially when, teachers that have been teaching for years, they can say, yes, your child is outside the range of typical in terms of their inattention, or, you know what, I think your child's just a little bit immature, but I actually see that they've made progress so far in this school year, so I wouldn't be as concerned. So your teacher and your school support personnel can be tremendous resources as well.
Yeah, you can ask for some of those testing, like the Vanderbilt and the Connors, and your doctor will probably ask for that too. So right. Thank you so much for the information. And Dr. Laura Saunders, child psychologist at Institute of Living, we appreciate, as always, your wisdom.
Happy to help, Kara.
Thanks. Please feel free to share this on your social media or with your friends and family. Also recommend you can check out Attitude Magazine. That's ADD. Attitude Magazine. Lots of information there to get yourself educated. Thanks for being here. You can follow me on social media at Kara Sundlin. I do like to share this content there. Have a great day and be well.